If your front derailleur is sounding like this or doing this, then it probably means it needs adjusting. Hello and welcome everyone, Nicholas from Bicycle here, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to adjust the height and angle, the limiting screws, and also how to set the cable tension on your front derailleur. To do all this you'll need a 2, 4 and possibly a 5mm hex key, or depending on the age, a Phillips screwdriver. Also, if you have a torque wrench, then go ahead and whip that out too. Let's get to it. For this video we are going to be focusing on Shimano front derailleurs, however the basics will apply across all brands. Before we dive into adjusting the limiting screws, we first want to check if the height and angle is set properly. To do this you'll first want to put the chain onto the smallest chainring in the front. Then you want to take 2 fingers, apply it on the back side of the cage, and then using your thumb you can then freely move the derailleur cage. So what we want to do is align the derailleur cage with the largest chainring. Then we want to check the gap between the bottom side of the cage and the teeth on the largest chainring. The gap should be around 2 to 3 millimeters. You can gauge the gap by using a 2mm hex key and placing it between the teeth. In this case, the height is set properly. If it were too low, the derailleur cage would just rub against the teeth of the large chainring. If it were too high, the chain would just be thrown off. If this is the case, you'll need to adjust it. However, before we adjust the height, we also want to check the angle. So again, push the derailleur cage above the large chainring, and then from above, check if the cage is parallel to the largest chainring. In this case, it is. However, if it was looking like this or like this, then it'll also need adjusting. If the height and angle on your front derailleur is set properly, then you can skip to the next chapter where we set the low limiting screw. However, if not, then this is how you set the height and angle. Start out by removing the cap from the gear cable bolt. Then, using the 4mm hex key, loosen the gear cable bolt. However, remember how the cable was routed before you completely remove it. Now, how you adjust the height and angle of your front derailleur is very dependent on the mounting system that your front derailleur has. However, most common mounts will be brace-on or clamp-on mounts. In this case, we have a brace-on mount. So again, using your 4mm hex key, go ahead and loosen the bolt that is securing the derailleur to the frame. Once we have that loose, you can now see that we can freely adjust the height and also the angle of the derailleur. Another important thing before we get to adjusting the angle or height, most people don't realize that there's actually a bolt hidden in the middle of the derailleur, which acts as a support bolt. This bolt is usually screwed in all the way on a sticker that was provided and can be placed on the frame itself to avoid damage, or on a plate that is on the derailleur itself. However, if you have no plate or sticker that the bolt can be secured on, just go ahead and completely unscrew it, and then we can ignore it after that. However, if there is a plate, still go ahead and unscrew it now. So like I mentioned before, we want to move now the derailleur up or down so that the gap between the bottom edge of the cage and the large chain is around 2 to 3 millimeters. Again, you can use your 2mm hex key to gauge the distance. Once you have the distance set, you can take your 4mm hex key and slightly tighten the bolt on the mount, however, just enough so that you can still adjust the angle. Now, looking from above, we want to again then make sure that the derailleur cage is parallel to the largest chainring. So around about there, looks good. Then once you have the angle set, you can go ahead and completely tighten the bolt securing the derailleur to the frame. However, make sure to hold the back of the derailleur cage, as when you tighten the bolt, it will cause the derailleur cage to tilt inwards. Once you have fully tightened the mounting bolt, you can go ahead and double check if everything is still parallel, the gap is still correct. And if you have a torque, you can go ahead and tighten the mounting bolt to around 6 to 7 Newton meters. And if you do have the support bolt I mentioned before and the plate protecting the frame, go ahead and screw it all the way in just so that it touches the plate. Do not screw it in any further, as it will cause the angle to change. If you do not have the protection plate, just go ahead and leave it alone. Now we have perfectly set the height and angle and can move on to setting the low limiting screw. Next up, we are going to set the low limiting screw. The low limiting screw physically prevents the derailleur from moving too far beyond the smallest chainring and derailing the chain into the frame. For starters, make sure the chain is still on the smallest chainring, and if you have not yet detached the gear cable, go ahead and do that using the 4mm hex key. Again, remember how the cable was routed so that when we attach it later, you remember how it was routed. Then shift up to the largest cog on the rear. Now we want to locate the screw that is marked with the letter L. If it is not marked, go ahead and screw both in to see which one causes movement in the derailleur. The one that causes movement in the derailleur will be the low limiting screw. Turning the low limiting screw clockwise will cause the derailleur to move outward, and turning the low limiting screw anti-clockwise will cause it to move towards the frame. Now again, looking from above, we want the gap between the outer edge of the cage and chain to be as small as possible, but without chain rub. So best way to do this is, while regularly pedaling, screw the L screw in until the cage starts to rub on the chain, and then in small increments slowly back it out until you no longer hear a chain rub and have a very small gap of about 1 millimeter. And here we can already see it's super fine, the gap. However, there is no chain rub. And that's it, the L limit screw is now set. Now that we have set the low limiting screw, we can go ahead and reattach the gear cable and adjust the cable tension. However, before we do all that, we will need to reset all the cable tensioners. Depending on your setup, you might have an inline barrel adjuster that is found on the cable coming from the left shifter, a barrel adjuster directly on the shifter, and or a tension screw found directly on the derailleur. For the barrel adjusters, tighten them all the way in by turning them clockwise and then back out by 1 turn. Just note that when tightening inline barrel adjusters, you want to be facing the back of the bike and then turn clockwise. If you have a tensioner screw on the front mech, go ahead and turn that all the way out using your 2mm hex key and then in again by 1 turn. Now pull slightly on the gear cable and shift down on the left shifter to ensure all cable is released. Then feed the cable through the grooves and under the cable bolt. Now again, firmly pull on the cable and then tighten the cable bolt using the 4mm hex key. If your front mech has the tension bolt, then make sure when tightening that the adjustment protrusion under the cable bolt makes contact with the input link. If you have a torque, then go ahead and tighten to 6 or 7 Newton meters. Now shift up once to the large chainring and examine what happens. If there is absolutely no movement in the front derailleur, then you're going to want to go ahead and undo the gear cable bolt once again and pull even firmer and then retighten again. If there is movement in the derailleur, however, the chain is struggling to get on or is delayed on getting onto the large chainring, then that means there is still too much slack in the derailleur. In this case, we want to increase tension by tightening the tensioner bolt found on the front mech until the chain pops up onto the large chainring. If you do not have this tensioner bolt found on the front derailleur, then you'll want to increase the cable tension by turning the barrel adjuster or inline adjuster anti-clockwise in small increments. Pedal forward and shift every turn to examine the shifting. Repeat until there is no excessive noise and the shifting is running smoothly. If the chain made it onto the largest chainring first try, or by adjusting the tensioner bolt, you've now gotten the chain on the large chainring, you might think to yourself, everything is now good to go, we set. However, for Shimano, on the side of the derailleur, you'll notice 2 white lines. For the correct tension, these 2 lines need to be aligned when the shifter is in the top trim position. For those who are not familiar with trim, push the lever all the way to the right and then slightly tap once on the downshift to get into the top trim. Now tighten the tensioner bolt until the 2 lines are aligned. You'll notice when turning this that the cable is slightly rotated to increase tension. Once you have set the cable tension, don't forget to put the cap back on. If you have made all these adjustments to the cable tension using the barrel adjusters and the cable tension screw, however the chain is still not moving onto the large chainring, then it can mean that the high limit screw is too loose. To solve this, go ahead and screw the H limit screw to about 2/3 all the way in. This should solve your problem and your cable tension should now be set. Lastly, let's set the high limiting screw that will ensure that the derailleur does not move too far beyond the large chainring and throw off the chain. To do this, shift down to the smallest cog in the rear and slowly and carefully to the largest chainring in the front. So similar to the low limiting screw, we want the gap between the chain and the outer edge of the cage to be as small as possible, but without chain rub. So again, from above, we're looking down and we want to, using our 2mm hex key, purposely loosen the H limiting screw to cause chain rub. So turning it anti-clockwise. When we hear the chain rub, then we want to start backing it out clockwise in small increments until we have a very small gap and can no longer hear any chain rub. The gap should be around 1 millimeter. And that's it. Go ahead and shift up and down on the front derailleur to ensure everything is running smoothly and no chains are falling off. Well, there you have it. Your front derailleur is now perfectly adjusted and you're now ready to hit the road. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave them down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, peace.